Hello, folks. How we all going? And welcome. Let's figure out how to get our overlay out of here. Hello, everybody. How you going? That's a very aggressive lens flare. That's quite exciting. How's everyone doing this wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, whoever you happen to be? My name is John. I am going to be your resident coach for this lovely session on hacking the technical interview. I hope you're all very excited to be here. I know that I am. It's going to be a wonderful little deep dive in all of the things I think people tend to get a little bit, not necessarily wrong, but there's a lot of complex things when it comes to getting the best out of your technical interviews, and we're going to hopefully cover the main topics that you would want to get a handle on. All right. So let's run through the basics. So, hello, folks. How you doing? I'm John. For some reason, I've got my very kind of like calming Bob Ross voice on this evening, so I guess we're going to be rolling with that. I'm a coach here at Major League Hacking. I have been hacking and organizing since around 2014, which means I'm actually coming up on my 10-year anniversary of hackathon attendee status in some form or another, which is really exciting. By day, I do various things in tech. I also act and produce, mainly in theatre, but also occasionally on screen. I am working my way towards my private pilot's license, and when I'm not doing any of those things, I love to mess around with hardware and occasionally get paid to set things on fire for money, which is, I would say, arguably one of the best jobs that you can have in the world. So, what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to sort of hit like the main. My plan for this is to have this session be quite flexible. So the main things that we're going to cover as like a definitive points is best practices for technical interviews. That's like your kind of common forms of technical interviews. I think we're going to cover like how those are generally tend to be structured, what you should expect, what you should be kind of thinking of going into them, how to solve some common technical interview questions, and also where to go for more practice. And I'll also be throwing a few resources in here and there that should be able to help you on that journey. We'll also the plan I have for this is to be pretty flexible. So if there's any questions music, excellent point. I was going to say I can't hear it on my side, so I'm guessing I need to bring it right down. There we go. Hopefully that should be a little better. But yeah, so we'll cover those points. My plan for this is to be pretty flexible. So if there's a question that you happen to have or something that you is like racking your brain around the technical interview process that you want answered, then feel free to throw it over in chat, and we will definitely take a look at it. There's no question too new or too surprising for this particular session. So let's kick off with like the baseline stuff. We'll talk a little bit about kind of technical interview tips. And in my eyes, like the biggest one here is that it is always okay to throw questions out there. If anything, in a lot of cases, I think one of the biggest things that folks tend to look for in technical interviews is how you approach a problem. And one of the best ways to kind of give them that understanding of how it is that you look at a particular issue is to ask questions, and to ask questions that really kind of get to the heart of the problem that you might be trying to solve. Whether that, like, I think that's more of a thing, especially when it comes to like whiteboard style interviews. I'd still do it with take homes, but generally, as a general rule, with take homes, it's usually better to try and like get a list of questions to send up front, and then later down the line, sort of like feedback. Whereas like if you're in an active interview process, it's usually a lot easier to kind of bounce stuff back and forth, get some rapport going. Yeah, that kind of thing. Like treat it as an opportunity to use the questions that you're asking to give them an understanding of how deeply you get the project and the problem that you're trying to solve. Next tip up: plan your answer before you begin coding or whiteboarding. I tend to do this quite a lot as a development process, just generally. If I'm writing out a fairly complex function and I'm trying to understand how I want it to be structured, I will sit down and I will just write out the like in like in words, I will like describe all of the things that I'm trying to do with that function. I'll just write it. I'll be like, okay, for each one of these items, I'm going to do this, this, and this. I'm then going to do this analysis, and then I'm gonna right at the bottom of this, I'm gonna concatenate it together and return this data. And generally, I find that's a really good way for you to quite quickly figure out if there's going to be any fundamental logical problems with what you're trying to build before you start building it. I think this is very much a similar thing in terms of whiteboard interviews. If they've given you the prompt up front, which some places will do now, which is nice. It's also worth, if you're neurodiverse folks, as an accessibility requirement. You can always ask if you can potentially have the prompt maybe 10-15 minutes up front, so that you can sort of have a chance to get a handle on it. But if you have been given the prompt up front, then I'd usually try and come into the interview with a set of expectations of what it is you're going to build, and have an idea of where the problem points might be, what they might be looking for with that specific concern. Like, how is that going to end up playing out in reality? And kind of like have that structure going in, because there's nothing worse, I think, than going into something like that and just not having any fundamental, how would I even put this? Without having a clear idea of how you're trying to get to the final way of solving what you're trying to do. You always want to have that in the back of your head going in, I think. Tip number 3, start coding or whiteboarding. Honestly, this can be one of the hardest things. I know that for a long while when I started interviewing initially, I always had a habit of sort of talking the interviewer's ear off on topics that were completely unrelated to the thing we were trying to solve. And in some cases, that can be good to like show off, like if you want to specifically show that you have knowledge in a certain area, like those kinds of casual conversations can be good. But at the same time, there's always an element where you're burning. If it's a fixed interview time and they don't have any time to go over, you're burning precious time with those conversations that you could be using to work on that problem and maybe get to a better solution and show off what you're looking for in that way. With some interviewers, it can also really annoy them if you're just trying to do anything other than the actual whiteboarding task that they've set for you. They can get a bit antsy when it comes to that. And talking through the bits where you're stuck. We kind of touched on this a little earlier, but like talking about the process that you're following, how you're actually understanding what's going on under the hood, what your fundamental knowledge is of the thing that you are building, I think is a pretty strong fundamental as a general rule. Tip number 4, it is important to refactor. I think this is something that's applicable across life and whiteboard interviews and the code that you will write once you've gotten the job, hopefully. There is no skill that I think is more important than this in a lot of ways. And knowing as well when to sit back and accept that, like, if you've got a potential solution to something and that solution isn't working, tap out early, because there's an element where it could be a case that you end up like magically solving it, but it just ends up costing you way more effort than it would have done under almost any other circumstance, which is never helpful. The other alternative is that you end up in a situation where you have caused too much trouble, let's say, and you're like just barreling down one single pipeline. And in both cases, it's worth just sort of sitting back, taking a moment, and just kind of taking stock of where you're at and whether you're sort of missing the forest for the trees and going, does this actually matter? Am I just trying to go down this particular way of solving this problem because it feels like the right way to solve it, or because there actually is a fundamental way to solve it that you think you have in the back of your head? But right, bottlenecks, unnecessary code and duplication. Yeah. Um, in some cases, yes. I think bottlenecks is really the main point there. Um, unnecessary code in whiteboarding situations, you're always going to end up writing some stuff that you never end up using. So I think in some cases that can sort of be dealt with as part of the process. Um, but duplication can be a big one. As a general rule, I would try and avoid ending up in situations where how would I put it? I try and avoid ending up in situations where you end up like replicating stuff that you could have just abstracted into a function. In a lot of cases, I think that's a pretty decent starting point for a lot of folks, is to just figure out where you're going with that and level. Explain your answer when you thoroughly when you finished. Yeah, similar kind of thing. I think in a lot of cases you might not need to do this as much if you've been explaining as you go through. But I also think it sometimes depends on the process. Like if you've been given a take home and it's then a interview after that where you are discussing the take home, you're probably going to want to start from like the beginning of when you solved it and sort of give them a little timeline of how you got to the solution that you have and why that solution you think is the best one for the problem. But if you've had somebody who has been sort of like talking through the process as you go, it's probably more likely that you've got a bit more flexibility there. You're not going to be as limited in terms of what you need to do to get them to that same level of knowledge. Especially if you're in a process where you've kind of given them a bit of background already, or if they know the problem particularly well, that can also help quite significantly. Okay, next up. We have the wonderful, well, I mean, I always get caught up by this, the wonderful problem of watching the time. This can, I think, could be less of an issue if you've got the kind of interview where you're being sort of semi-guided by the person who is doing it. But there's always an element of not letting the time slip by, making sure that you've always got that in the back of your mind, that you've got a way forward, and you know what you're planning on doing, you know where your solutions are going to end up being, and you know that they're going to be able to fit within the time that you've got to get the thing done. So if you're planning on like rolling up a bunch of infrastructure and trying to architect something real big, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to end up being able to execute on that. And in a lot of cases, I feel like that can also be kind of counterproductive, because what you really want in a lot of cases with a technical interview is that you want a clear idea of how you're going to. You want a clear idea of how you're going to approach the topic in a concise amount of time, not necessarily giving them a perfect version of what this thing could be, but giving them the closest version that they can get within that context. Yeah, so let's break this down with an example, and I'll talk through a couple of these. I think we'll do one here, and then we'll sort of touch on one in a bit. So we're going to go into a classic here. I'm sure all the folks who have potentially gone through your kind of like baseline FANG interviews will probably have been thrown this question at some point. It's known as FizzBuzz. It's a pretty simple concept. You create a function. It takes as an single input that's a number, and then it prints out 1 through that number. So if we say 10 is the input, it'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then we start to add a few rules on top of that. So if it's divisible by 3, then we print fizz instead of the number. If it's divisible by 5, we print buzz instead of the number. And if it's divisible by 3 and 5, then we print fizzbuzz. And the reason why this tends to be a pretty fun one is that there's a bunch of ways that you can really overcomplicate this, or also ways that you can end up with solutions that aren't particularly optimized. It's a relatively simple problem, but the way that it ends up working out in practice, you generally want something like pretty clearly simple. Honestly, in a lot of cases, it's used because it's so simple. unless they're specifically asking you to solve it in a specific like O-log, for example, I usually say this question tends to show up mostly when you're just like screening resumes, so that you're looking mainly at folks who, at the very least, have a pretty solid understanding of how to write software. So tip number one, let's go down to asking questions. So if you're thrown this problem, you're given this. Let's say you're given it a little bit before time. What are the kinds of questions that you think you might ask before solving this problem? And I'm gonna throw this over to chat. Give me a few. What are the kinds of things that you're going to be looking at in terms of a problem like this with this kind of structure? There's plenty of different areas we could go this. Do we start at 0? Yep, excellent question. I can't say I've ever come across. Actually, no, saying that I tell a lie. I've come across folks doing negative FizzBuzz before, as in you should be able to start from negative numbers and go all the way up through to positives, which complicates things slightly. There's definitely, definitely some structural stuff that we can do here. I'd probably say one of the biggest things would be what language. The company might want it in a specific language. If they're writing a lot of their own code in that language, they may well want to see how well you can operate within that. There's also a strong possibility that are they expecting you to live code it, or do they want you to provide an example? In which case, if you're live coding it, you're probably going to need to think about, are they providing you with a development environment? Are they expecting you to screen share your own development environment? Are they planning to have you put it in a REPL? Do they want it to match a specific time complexity? We talked about that a little earlier. There's whatever the specific requirements are that might be on top of the problem itself. I think are the main things to keep an eye out for here. I will also I'll try and show you. Yeah, here we go. Let me show you a little example of what I'd say is a pretty good solution to this. So this is written in JavaScript. In fact, here we go. So the way this works, this is running from 1 to 100, and then we're just calling this function here. And I think one of the first nice things here is that the code itself, I haven't just taken all this logic and I've smacked it in here. I've actually taken the time to separate it into a function. We've got some nice code cleanliness here. It also works out at the end. And then I'm just doing a real simple. Again, this is a really simple approach of like, if it's divisible by 15, which would be 5. Then we return FizzBuzz. If it's divisible by 3, return Fizz, divisible by 5, return Buzz. And then we just essentially return that to string and then just console log those individually. There's also an option here where you could do, we could set a variable up here, and then we could do Fizz, and then we could do like that. So that would end up automatically creating FizzBuzz without us having to necessarily have this step, which can be quite nice because it'll build the word as needed. Slightly cleaner, but I mean this is also very readable code. So the other benefit here is that it's nice and simple. So tip number 2. Plan your answer. So as we were talking about a little earlier, write out some wonderful pseudocode. So in this case, they've done a little description of roughly what I have here. So it takes one parameter, we have a function for it. You then check if that element is divisible by 3. And if yes, then you print fizz. If it's divisible by 5, you print buzz. You then check if it's divisible by both, and then you print fizz buzz. Otherwise, you just print the number itself. And that is like I said, you can see me like as I read through that, you can see pretty clearly where you would start to then build the logic out, and also that that logic fully makes sense for the specific problem that we are trying to solve. And step 3, which is the bit that we just talked about, is you're going to sit down and you're going to write out your solution relative to that pseudocode. And in a lot of cases, I won't necessarily do all of that in one go. I won't delete all the pseudocode. I'll like rewrite a function for one section of the pseudocode, and then I'll check it, and then I'll move on to the next bit and just like slowly build that solution out as I go, so that I know that it's matching up to the logic that I was actually planning in the first place, essentially, that everything pretty figures out. Everything pretty much gets figured out by the time that you made it through that process. And then, yeah, write out your solution. So this is a little solution similar to the one I just touched on in Python. This is, again, using some slightly different stuff. If we think about different languages here, again, we've got a thing of the range is going to be slightly different. They're also doing 2 individual divided by 3 and divided by 5 checks there. And then it just becomes a long set of if and else loops, which all makes sense. Is there a video in this slide? I don't believe it's playing. If it is, yes, that's a good point. I was just going to say, what's going on there? And then I reread the code for a second. So the specific thing here is that this doesn't quite match up with our logic. And this is also a similar thing when it comes to a lot of control flows. Is that the way this works in practice? It checks if the current number is divisible by 3, and if it is, it prints fizz, and then it just moves on to the next number because it's an else if. You see that little elif there. So that means it's an else if loop. So what this means, if it's divisible by 3 and 5, it will never make it to that final fizz buzz check. It will only ever print fizz and then disappear. So really, you need that fizz buzz check to end up at the top of your logic if you're going to do it as elif loops, so that it is the first thing that breaks. Or alternatively, take the else out and just have them as sequential ifs. Potentially, that could also be a solution to that problem. Yeah, good logic. So yeah, that is again a pretty good example of why you should always be keeping an eye out for situations where your functional logic like that doesn't necessarily line up with reality, especially in cases where there's that kind of complexity going on. And then tip 5, explain your answer. So like I said, I went through it a little earlier and gave you an example of that with the JavaScript version of the code. I'm sure you could do a very similar kind of thing with the Python version. These are all really, really good things to have in your back pocket. In a lot of cases, they're very helpful. Very helpful to be able to sort of talk through it before you get to the point of explaining it to your interviewer, because it might be that in the process of you explaining something out loud that you happen to come across something where you go, oh, that this immediately makes sense. Like why I've managed to do it like this way, or why it hasn't worked out the way that I thought it would. And all of those are really good things to just bear in mind. Rubber duck debugging is a wonderful tool. And tip number 6, what's your time? Double check how long each one of these things takes. Do you think we split up the time efficiently here? How have we hit all of the necessary steps? And like, yeah, I think this is a good rule of thumb. Though I think generally you may want slightly more time to plan, maybe 10 to 15. But like 10% to plan, 50% to implement, 20% to go back through and refactor, and then 20% again to go through and discuss what your solution ends up being in practice. Yeah, I would. Again, these are general examples. I would usually say that you want to vary these slightly depending on the circumstance and the timing involved. So like, yeah, your mileage may vary, adjust these as appropriate, but I think this is usually a pretty good rule of thumb. All right, so I am going to hand it over to you folks. So I'm gonna provide you with a little example that I cooked up a little earlier. We're gonna get you folks to hopefully provide us with some examples here that we can work on. So let me see if I've got this question handy. Where's one that I have used before? Here we are. This is always a fun one. So yeah, let's give you folks this wonderful example. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you folks to write me a function that takes a string and checks if any word in it has duplicate letters. That is, any string, you can throw it in any length, and it's going to check to see whether within each word there are multiples of a letter. And if they are, then it like prints out that word and that letter and the number of duplicates. And this is sort of basic as an example of like how we're going to go through this process. So if you throw large sort string, yeah, absolutely. No real functional limits. I'm not looking necessarily for time complexity here. It's more that we're just going to look at how these solutions tend to turn out. So I think let's throw like 4 or 5 minutes on this, and then we'll see where we get to. So have a crack at that, and I will see you very shortly. And I'm also gonna bump this over to Q&A. So while we're getting all of that code nicely put together, if there's any questions that you folks happen to have around the interview process, anything that you want to specifically ask me, then definitely let me know. I would highly recommend if you're not familiar as well, taking a look at HackerRank and LeetCode, both of which are really good resources for these kinds of technical interview examples. So if what you really want to do is like sit down and brush up on those, then definitely head on over there. But I'm also happy to answer any questions on more of like the general interviewing side of things as well. Any further questions? Right, looks like we're pretty quiet on this front. I'll leave it for another couple of minutes, but if there don't happen to be any further questions or code examples, then I will wrap things up. Can you say more about the difficulty of questions for different kinds of jobs? Yeah, I think honestly, I think that it kind of in a lot of cases it tends to it tends to vary less to do, I think, with the kinds of jobs and more with the seniority of them, and also to a certain degree the type of role. A lot of fan companies tend to have pretty high bars for the kinds of engineers that they'll hire, so the levels of difficulty can usually be pretty high even for lower level roles. Um, but especially if once you're, if anything, I think it's sort of the inverse in a lot of ways. When you start getting to more senior level roles, your levels of difficulty sort of go down to some degree because partly because you have more experience, but also because um, they're judging you less on solving on understanding how to solve these kind of core fundamentals and more on how you think and operate from like an architectural point of view. Um, so there's a hmm. What is usually prioritized when evaluating how you solve a question? Efficiency, time you took lines of code, if you actually solved it. In a lot of cases, if it depends. I think this is it's really variable, and there's no clear answer to that one necessarily. I will say that I've definitely come across questions that are designed so that you aren't necessarily really so that what they're looking at isn't that you finish it. It's more about how you think about the process. And you can usually spot those kinds of things because they're questions that really feel like you shouldn't be able to solve them in the time that you've been given. And in a lot of cases, it's probably true. And I wouldn't necessarily get discouraged from that. Like I've definitely been in that scenario before where it kind of feels like you're being set up to fail a little bit. And in a lot of cases, it's not really that. It's more that they're looking to understand how you would work your way through the process to solving that problem without having to like solve the entire problem within the interview time. Um, Efficiency can always be a big one. For me, code readability tends to be a really big thing. Um, like I don't necessarily care if something is the most. If something is an incredibly efficient solution, but then proceed to give it to a junior engineer and they can't read it, then it's not a very good solution, in my eyes at least. Um, and I know a lot of engineering managers, especially who have that as a pretty big metric. Um, Time you took. In some cases, yes. I think if you're spending a whole bunch of time trying to figure out the language, then that's not necessarily always a good thing. Make sure that you're coming into your interviews under like knowing well enough the language that you're writing the challenge in. Or potentially, if you're not that confident in that language, making that clear up front, maybe asking to solve it in a different language. Um, Lines of code. I mean, I'm sure there are some folks who measure based on lines of code. I can't say that I've seen that as a metric in a good few years. It's sort of fallen out of it's fallen out of favor. I'd say. Yeah, I think it's very much fallen out of favor, I think, in recent years, both as a metric for interviews and really as a metric internally to a lot of places. Um, it's just not a. I don't know. If anything, this gets really nebulous, but I personally think a stronger metric is actually less lines of code rather than more, because it means that you're actually not only spending the time to decrease the complexity of your applications, but you're also thinking about how you, like, if you spend an hour thinking about how to come up with a 30-line solution, or you spend 2 hours writing a 400-line one, I know which one of those I would rather have in a code base. And yeah, if you actually solved it, I think in a lot of cases, if you get pretty close, don't worry too much because again, in most cases, these processes are really focused more on them trying to understand how it is that you approach problems as opposed to whether you're capable of like fully solving one. If it's a pretty simple problem and you don't get it, then that might be more of a like if you're going for like an SRE role and it's an infrastructure thing and you can't quite get your head around how you're going to deal with it, then yeah, maybe that's going to cause some issues. Um, but more broadly, I wouldn't worry too much on that front. Do you ever combine hardware hacking and pyrotechnics? Yes, actually. One of the earliest projects that I ever worked on, and ironically one that I'm actually coming back round to at the moment, um, was pyrotechnics control systems. So electrical engineering, specifically around designing systems to control pyro. Um, so that was one of the first projects that I ever worked on. Was a pretty simple system for doing that. I'm on account of a few things now, more recently working on a more complex version of a very similar system, but specifically focused more on specifically more focused on wireless control rather than anything else. Quite welcome. Any final questions? Anything that you feel might be intriguing? Is MLH hiring? That's an excellent question. We are hiring. Let me double check. I know that we are still presently hiring. Actually, I can't tell you off the top of my head. I believe that we're no, we are currently still hiring coaches. Yes, so if you happen fancy becoming a coach, you can definitely apply for that. We are also currently looking for some front end software engineers and full stack software engineers for Ruby out of India. So if you happen to be India based, know Ruby, and want to come and do some fun stuff over here at MLH, then definitely head on over and apply for those roles. It's a wonderful time that I highly recommend. Right, folks. I think we've pretty much hit the top of our questions so far. So, with that, thank you so much for coming along to this session. It has been an absolutely wonderful time. I am very happy to have been here with you. I've been John. Thank you so much for coming along, and have a wonderful rest of Global Hack Week. Happy hacking.